Folklore and lore aren't always scary. Sometimes they're a little bit weird. At least in Massachusetts, they are sometimes that weird platypus-looking creature taxidermied on the wall of that restaurant out west. Or that time a guy in your town made an immortality potion. Or that awkward moment in history where your shining local college served radioactive oatmeal to children. Now, I love telling stories that scare the bejesus out of people, including myself, but around here I like telling weird stories more than about anything else. That's why today we're going to talk about more of Massachusetts' unusual folklore. Now, before we get started, I just want to say thank you for tuning in, and let you know that, if you want to see this channel continue to grow, the best possible thing you can do for me is subscribe, like the video, leave a comment, and most importantly, watch until the end. It'll never cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. With this in mind, come with me today, and let's see what Massachusetts has in store in the weird department. Our next story takes us to Malden, Massachusetts, and to the doorstep of a man named Ephraim Gray, who lived there around the mid-1800s. Ephraim wasn't the sort of guy that was well loved in the community. Rather, accounts say he treated the nearby community pretty coldly, doing his best to avoid the other residents of Malden and scoffing at them whenever he met them in public. Because of this, Ephraim actually had a servant, whose name appears lost to time, who essentially did all of his chores for him, everything from shopping to groceries to paying taxes, anything that would put Ephraim in contact with other people. That being said, there was something the locals noticed about this recluse, that starting around the mid-1840s, a strange smell began to emanate from Ephraim's home. Now, Ephraim hadn't passed away or anything, it wasn't that sort of smell. Rather, it was a strange chemical sort of smell, something odd, and this odor would go on for years until one day in 1850, when local Malden residents noticed, wait, that weird smell's gone. They probably didn't think much of the smell ceasing either. I'd imagine that is until Ephraim's servant showed up to the Malden police station to announce something. Ephraim, you see, had died, and with his death would come an explanation for this strange smell. Ephraim, you see, according to the servant, had been cooking up a potion that would imbue immortality upon the one who consumed it, and had ordered his servant to announce to the public this potion's recipe, and that it would return the dead to life, eventually, in a perfectly preserved body. So, yeah, pretty weird note to end on, and in most cases, you'd think that was that. Ephraim's potion didn't work, and he'd be tossed in the ground to rot like everyone else. But the thing is, he didn't rot. You see, rumors of this immortality potion spread far and wide, and eventually they made it into the ears of some Harvard medical students in 1870. These students, you see, were ambitious too, and they didn't just humor the legend, they wanted to test its veracity. Thus they went to Malden Cemetery and dug up his grave, prying open his casket and being stunned because, if you believe the legend, there was Ephraim, looking alive as, well, the day he died. Now, they did describe him as a bit damp, which is pretty disgusting, but otherwise he looked well. According to them, there was no visible decay. That being said, by their estimation, Ephraim was not alive, and thus, once again, the story ended with them sealing up Ephraim's grave and burying him, sharing the story of what they did with a select few. And again, here you'd assume that was that. The legend ended, now with the strange reality where Ephraim was strangely well preserved and nothing more. But not so fast. See, in the mid-1900s, Malden Cemetery was actually moved. Its tombstones and caskets alike had to be relocated to clear the way for a road to be paved, a classic American tradition, and as such, they gradually moved headstones and caskets, one by one. But when they got to Ephraim's grave, something peculiar was noted. The casket, you see, was strangely lightweight, and thus they opened the casket only to find that it was, of course, empty. And that's where the true legend finds its spark. See, this has created a number of talking points over the years. Some think the Harvard students that dug up Ephraim may have stolen his body. Others think perhaps Ephraim's old servant may have fulfilled one more unmentioned request for him, decades after his burial. And as I'm sure you'd guess, others, perhaps many, claim that Ephraim really had developed a potion for immortality, and that when those Harvard medical students dug him up, they also woke him up, and thus after they made their way out of the cemetery, he'd also pull himself up. wandering off into parts unknown. Anyways, that's the story of Ephraim. Let me know, have you heard this legend? And do you think that Ephraim really did wake up on that fateful night in the mid-1900s? If I were to ask you, where was the first liquid-fueled rocket launched, you'd probably be unsure. And seriously, don't feel bad. This stuff is relatively close to my actual job, and I didn't even know the answer until recently. But I'd guess you'd probably put forward something reasonable. Maybe a military test site, perhaps an airport. You know, places where things are known to fly into the air with some frequency. I'd have probably guessed the same. The thing is, though, this is totally wrong. In reality, if you can believe it, the very first liquid-fueled rocket ever was launched on a humble modern-day golf course in Auburn, Massachusetts. This is the story of that fateful rocket. This episode begins with a man named Dr. Robert H. Goddard, a man you might know well. Before launching the first liquid-fueled rocket in 1926, Goddard was a visionary American physicist and inventor who actually laid the theoretical and experimental foundations for modern rocketry. He was born in 1882 in Massachusetts, and he was fascinated in his early age by space and flight. A fascination that, funny enough, supposedly began when reading H.G. Wells' science fiction novel War of the Worlds in 1898. Following the lead of the Chinese, who actually invented gunpowder rockets in the 13th century, Goddard would begin building gunpowder rockets of his own in 1907 when he was a student at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and this led him to perform his doctoral research on rocket experiments as a physics student at Clark University. Through this work, he actually proved that rockets can move in an airless vacuum. In other words, he proved a rocket could move in space if you ignited it. And he also explored the mathematical theory behind rocket propulsion, even patenting some of his concepts and getting grants from the Smithsonian Institute to conduct his research. This all led to the 1919 publication of, I quote, "A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes," which was published by the Smithsonian, describing how rockets could be used to reach high altitudes, and even, cue the laugh track, the moon. Ha 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 ha, what a silly guy thinking he could reach the moon. For this work, Goddard was largely ridiculed, and the New York Times even proposed that Goddard was less knowledgeable than most high school students for thinking that rockets would work in space. Well, that aged like milk. Regardless, in the face of harsh criticism, Goddard, in December of 1925, would test a liquid-fueled rocket at Clark University inside of the physics building. And then on March 16th of 1926, he would prop up this rocket on what is a modern-day golf course, and what was then his Aunt Effie's farm in Auburn, Massachusetts. Here, he would prove the world at least partially wrong, and right here, at what would one day be the 9th fairway of a golf course between the tee and the green, the first liquid-fueled rocket would be launched, flying approximately 41 feet into the air and traveling 184 feet horizontally. Funny enough, at this same spot, Goddard would continue launching rockets, achieving a maximum altitude of 90 feet with this homebrewed setup. After 1929, he'd leave this golf course behind, testing rockets elsewhere, until he passed away in 1945. And he even received recognition from Charles Lindbergh for his work, the legendary aviator. He sadly wouldn't live into the 60s, though, to see the massive advances in rocketry that were soon to come. While he was mocked in life, Robert H. Goddard today is respected posthumously and regarded as one of the pioneers of American rocketry, even if in life he was hardly supported to the degree that he deserved. Perhaps the greatest honor he's been bestowed is that NASA's flagship campus in Greenbelt, Maryland is now named in his honor as NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. In Shirley, Massachusetts, a place perhaps better known for its association with the father of the Appalachian Trail, Benton McKay, than anything else, there's a restaurant and concert venue named Bull Run Restaurant that's supposedly named after a local fight that broke out upon hearing of the First Battle of Bull Run in Virginia. And I mean, it's well-reviewed, and apparently has a heck of a prime rib, but it's not exactly weird, right? Well, maybe not in and of itself, but if you look at the art on its walls, one thing will probably stand out to you. See, while walls of restaurants are usually adorned with paintings, flowers, and various knickknacks, these walls have something labeled as the head of the Egopantis. the taxidermied head of a creature that sort of looks like a platypus with a strange name that supposedly roamed these parts long, long ago. As the tale goes, this restaurant, whose building dates back to the 1740s as a tavern, was actually frequented by this creature known as the Egopantis. It roamed the woods behind the tavern, and locals were apparently struck with fear upon seeing it. Now, descriptions of what it did are scarce, and the few bits of lore I've actually seen touted by those at the restaurant essentially say the creature was territorial. The forest belonged to it, and it didn't feel like sharing with native people or colonists. Perhaps it was in that light that one night a captain named Nathaniel Smith had his own run-in with this creature. The story says it was nighttime, and Nathaniel was walking near the tavern. Then from the woods he heard a, I quote, terrible cry from the forest, and suddenly he heard branches breaking and trees shifting, as whatever this was slowly lumbered towards him, apparently unhappy with Nathaniel's proximity to his home. Nathaniel, though, was not just a simple colonist. He was a captain, and he would pull the musket from his back and fire at the Egopantis, causing it to briefly flee and run across the nearby brook, from which the Egopantis would ultimately fall due to its injuries. Some say it took 10 days to die. After it passed away, Smith would proudly proclaim, "I did it. I slayed the Egopantis. I wounded it, and it charged at me from across the brook. Then I delivered the killing blow." That was it. After supposedly hundreds of years of protecting these parts, the Egopantis was dead. They would, of course, remove its head, and Nathaniel would have it mounted on the wall of the tavern, where it remains to this day, accompanied by the supposed musket that felled the beast. Seriously, at least according to the restaurant, it's been right here for about 200 years, and I mean, it sort of looks like a platypus to me, which is, I guess, pretty cool. So with this story in mind, let's ask the question, was the Egopantis real? Well, to start, there was some limited credence in the form of a supposed old letter to the Smithsonian asking the Egopantis head to be investigated. Now, I couldn't find this letter, but some people say it exists, so I guess take that for what you will. And if you buy the stories, a woman named Elizabeth Ryan actually was sent out by the American Institute in New York City, which is part of the Smithsonian, to check the creature's head out. And again, supposedly, she had no explanation for the creature, and thought the head to be real, or at least comprised of real animal fur and skin. Admittedly, there's not many more details about this creature, or its supposed origin, and from what I can tell, the word Egopantis doesn't seem to be mentioned in any media until at least after Lee and Mary Guercio purchased the Bull Run restaurant in 1946. Also take that for what you will. So, with this short story in mind, let me know. Have you seen the Egopantis in the tavern? Do you believe it was a real creature that roamed the forests and swamps behind this old tavern? Or do you align with most people and think that the Egopantis is likely a fabrication of a mythical creature among the ranks of the fearsome critters invented in logging camps in the early 1900s? And that its taxidermied head is a combination of many different animals that called the area home. Whatever you believe, I parrot the words of the Bull Run restaurant, and I say, the Egopantis is dead. Long live the Egopantis. Now, there's nothing I quite like a story of supposed pre-Columbian contact with the Americas, and this one is a doozy. Trust me, we all know that Vikings were in North America well before Columbus even said goo goo gaga, but did you know that in Massachusetts there are also whispers that there might have been medieval knights of all things buried in Westford? As the story goes, a Scottish earl, or a noble of Scotland, named Henry Sinclair is known to have made a voyage with a crew of explorers, including knights, in the spring of 1398. In 1390, it's known that Sinclair commanded a fleet of 13 or so warships, and he had just successfully conquered Shetland. But during the voyage home from this successful campaign, he would run into a fisherman, and this fisherman told him about some strange distant lands full of native people. Sinclair at first scoffed, assuming he was just talking about Greenland, and nearly told him to get lost. But the man clarified. He was talking about a land further west than Greenland, a land his people had previously been to. This is the rumor, at least, and the rumor goes that Sinclair eventually would be so intrigued that he would attempt this journey with a handful of his knights. Sinclair and his knights, of course, would sail towards Greenland, and after hitting it, they would continue traveling west. And then, sure enough, they would hit new land. At first, the legend says they either hit the Bay of Fundy or Guysborough Harbor, or sometimes they hit somewhere in Newfoundland. Regardless, this land was a bit colder than was described to him, and therefore, when spring came, he would sail, I quote, 6 days to the southwest, further along the coast, to reach an area with a warmer climate. And he'd find this warmer climate, stumbling upon what is described to be modern-day Massachusetts. They would of course head inland here to explore this new land, and they'd eventually get to where modern-day Westford rests. And here, a man named Sir James Gunn, one of Sinclair's knights, started to, as the story goes, develop a cough, and then he got a bit sick. He really wasn't doing so hot. They tried to help, but he only deteriorated. This knight would pass away right here in Westford. They, of course, would bury him in proper knight fashion, burying him in his armor and memorializing him with a slab over his grave, supposedly with a sword, shield, and a family crest inscribed upon a stone. It's said that these carvings would be discovered in 1873, so a long time after the region was settled. Most at first thought this was actually a carving by the native people, or perhaps by the Irish. And in 1950, it was finally put forward that, maybe this was a sign from Henry Sinclair's expedition. And, whether or not you believe the story, that's the legend they've settled on, and now because of this, there's a stone tablet recounting this journey of Henry Sinclair. It goes like this, actually. Prince Henry I Sinclair of Orkney, born in Scotland, made a voyage of discovery to North America in 1398. After wintering in Nova Scotia, he sailed to Massachusetts, where he would visit the first Dunkin' Donuts in Quincy, Massachusetts, after which his loyal knight would get dysentery from a wake-up rap. The punch-hole armorial effigy which adorns this ledge is a memorial to this knight. Okay, I'll admit I made up a tiny part of that, but I'll let you decide which part. In the aftermath of this supposed legend, facts that we know and understand come back. Sinclair and his knights, shortly after, would return to Scotland. Here, shortly after this, Sinclair would discover the English were raiding his towns, and in a rush to defend them, he would be mortally wounded, and ultimately he would pass away. Today, he remains buried at the Roslin Chapel in Scotland. Then, in the 1950s, as folks started to speculate whether this carving, which admittedly doesn't look like much more than a natural formation other than the sword part, could be that of a knight's sword from Sinclair's expedition. This, of course, was further perpetuated by the accounts of the Sinclair expedition by a duo known as the Zeno brothers, two Venetian navigators and brothers that were actually part of the Henry Sinclair expedition that supposedly crossed the Atlantic. They actually referred to Sinclair as Zickney, a man they were factually known to explore with. They claimed in the recountings of their travels that they visited places such as Friesland, Iseria, Estotaland, and Drogeo, places that most think are fictional or poor recountings of modern locations, other than Estotaland, which many conflate with Newfoundland. As for Drogeo, most think this is in reference to North America. This narrative was published in 1558 by a descendant of the Zeno brothers, and it famously includes a map that shows a sort of distorted view of the North Atlantic, including islands we now know do not exist. Now, to be clear, given this was published in the mid-1500s, well after 1492, many take this to have simply been a Venetian grab at notoriety in an attempt to show they were actually the ones to get to North America before Columbus, and they wanted to alter the founding story of the Americas for nationalistic reasons. This, to be clear, is how these expeditions are viewed by most historians. The descendants of the Zeno brothers, in contrast, claim that in Scotland there's a chapel with images of American plants carved into it, in particular a sunflower, corn, and aloe vera, although, admittedly, historians claim they're just stylized depictions of European plants. There's also a Native American legend that claims Glooskap, a Native American spiritual hero we actually recently talked about, is actually Sinclair, as this legend tells of a bearded visitor with red hair and green eyes who taught the natives how to fish with nets. So, either way you slice it, there's a lot of controversy here. A lot of flimsy details linked together, if you will. And perhaps the most solid ground this story can stand on is the fact that there's what appears to be an inscription of a sword on a rock in Westford, Mass. So, what do you think? Do you think this inscription is even human-made, or is it just the way the rock naturally wore away over time? Do you think the Zeno brothers' account of a transatlantic journey is factual, or a lie meant to spread a narrative that they succeeded before Columbus? I'd love to know your thoughts down below. So I wanted to start adding a short portion to the middle of my videos where I give a shout out to other members of our strange community that love weird history, cryptids, ghosts, and the like. Heck, I might now and again even share folks out there that I think are championing a cause I care about. For today's shout out, I'd love to share the awesome work of Lisa. Her email is in the top right of the screen if you want to reach out to her. Lisa has shared with me a couple of times her monochromatic paintings of cryptids, images of which I'm sharing on screen right now. She's sort of doing the same thing as me too, albeit her work is probably a lot tougher, and she's trying to paint cryptids by region. These paintings are 8-inch by 8-inch acrylic paints. My personal favorite, Lisa, is actually the first one you shared with me, of Tinkerhell, Batboy, and the Snallygaster. See, I'm a big Snallygaster fan. Also, she made this awesome Oozlefinch drawing, which makes me feel a little more afraid of it than I was from my original telling of the story. Anyways, while this isn't an ad, I don't want or expect pay from it, my impression is that Lisa is selling this awesome artwork, so you should go ahead and reach out to her. She's shown me everything from artwork of the Squonk to Mothman to Melonheads, and if you want some of this cool art, you'd better reach out fast to that email in the top right, because I'm not sure how long these cool paintings are going to last. Also, if you're doing something similar, feel free to reach out. I'd love to share your cool or impactful work. Small towns are going to be a theme today, and funny as it is, Westminster, Massachusetts is going to be larger than a lot of those in this list, with a population of about 8,213. And in this small town, there's a wall that, again, like most of the items on this list, is at first completely unremarkable. In modern day, it's just about 11 feet high, 15 feet thick, and 75 feet in total, running along North Common Road and the property it lies on. The thing is, though, this wall dates back to a strange and possibly infuriating story, and it tells a simple but telling tale. One of two men with very different opinions on religion, and therefore what you should do on Sundays. This story starts with a man named Edmund Proctor, who in 1852 moved into Westminster, Massachusetts, buying a farm at modern-day 89 North Common Road. And I mean, if you know your modern farmers, you know those folks are hardworking, and farm work is a 24/7 type of job. Your crops and your livestock don't give you a break. Edmund Proctor embodied this sort of work ethic, and respected his practice, working his tail off, even on Sundays. Most accounts I've read basically paint him as an exemplary farmer, and here he lived with his wife Mary and their 8 children. The thing is, though, his neighbor, Farwell Morse, didn't exactly like that. Farwell Morse, you see, abided by puritanical traditions. In modern day, you'd call him a religious zealot, and he'd probably have agreed with this sentiment. Also, to be clear, this wasn't exactly rare back in the day in Mass. Back in 1852, many Massachusetts locals followed puritanical traditions. It wasn't the norm per se, but it wasn't rare either, and this means he was not a fan of working on Sundays, as Sundays were the Sabbath, and time again, he would tell Edmund Proctor that he really didn't appreciate that he worked on his farm on Sundays. I should note, it probably doesn't help that Proctor was well known to swear like a sailor as he plowed his fields, even on Sundays. Edmund Proctor, of course, sort of took the mind-your-own-business approach to this, which I can't entirely blame him for. He wasn't going to stop working and potentially harm his farm's productivity just because his neighbor told him to. That being said, as the legend goes, Farwell Morse wouldn't shut up about his work, and Edmund Proctor, being a practical man, took matters into his own hands. If Morse wouldn't shut up about his work, well, Proctor wouldn't let him see him working in the first place. Thus, Proctor, as he plowed his fields, took advantage of every single rock he dug up, placing them gently along his property line to the point of insanity. I kid you not, for years, maybe decades, he would pile these stones, of which there were many, as high as he could to gradually hinder the view of Morse on his property. The tallest point, of course, was directly in front of Morse's property. This, I kid you not, ended up creating the tallest stone wall in New England, a title that still holds, and gained the name the Wall of Spite, or Spite Wall. My impression is that after this wall was built, well, Morse couldn't hear or see Proctor's work anymore, and thus Proctor would work without being bothered further, working, if you buy the story, up until he passed away at 1890, at the age of 71. The legend goes that the day before he died, he actually found another rock and threw it atop this wall of spite. The home, of course, would remain in the family up until the early 2000s, though by then it didn't belong to anyone who dwelled on the property at the time of this scuffle. Until recently, the property remained a working farm, funny enough too, that its previous owner, Joe Serio, described as thriving, and they even had a nice little pumpkin patch from what I'm reading. Luckily, everything I've read suggests that there is no more argument over when labor is performed here. But despite this, the spite wall remains a testament to this old feud, in lieu of the fact that in 1887, a law was actually passed in Massachusetts that actually made spite fences, or walls that essentially annoy thy neighbor against the law. When most think of Massachusetts, they don't think of Erving. It's a small community, a bit north of Amherst, that with a modern population of about 1,600 largely remains off of the beaten path, despite its stark natural beauty. That being said, if you visit, you'll find something odd dotted around it. Just northwest of the city, there's a feature named Hermit Mountain, upon which there's a Hermit lookout, and to get up here there's a trail named the Hermit Cave Trail. Clearly, back in the day, something interesting was going on in these mountains, and this something might be better called someone, and it was a man that went by perhaps the fabricated name John Smith, and who was better known as the Hermit of Erving Castle. The following is the story of this man's life, as told to locals by him, and the subsequent story of how he left his mark on this small community, becoming one of the many famous hermits of New England that we've talked about on this channel. This hermit was born on July 10th of 1823 in Perth, Scotland, and John's early life was marked by hardship. His father was a Scottish Marine, and his mother passed away when he was young, leaving him to be raised by his grandmother. He apparently only met his father twice, and both times he treated him pretty coldly. Despite his difficult start, John eventually became an actor, but heartbreak would alter the course of his life. After falling in love with a woman who didn't love him back, he wrote a poem lamenting that her, I quote, hair was not braided for him. Regardless of the fact that her hair was not braided for him, rejection left a lasting wound. He never ended up marrying, later saying that his heart was too sore, and he then gave up his career as an actor and declared himself, in his own words, a professional hermit, living in solitude in Scotland for a while before eventually sailing for America. At the age of 40, in May of 1866, John arrived in Boston, and from there he made his way gradually to Erving, Massachusetts, a centuries-old settlement at that point with few native inhabitants remaining since King Philip's War. He arrived quietly, and it literally took months before locals even noticed him. He found a rocky ledge about a half-mile north up the mountain from Miller's River and began building a wooden structure into the side of the cliff. Though he called it a castle, it was in truth a cave. That cave still exists today, and it's well known as the Hermit Cave. Initially, John gathered food to survive. Berries, eggs, and other things he could essentially steal from nature, but over time he started cultivating vegetables and potatoes. Eventually, he was discovered, in large part because he made trips to Erving Center for supplies, where he often chatted with locals. Despite his hermit title, he was friendly and engaging, and after telling the story of his life to locals, people began to visit him deliberately, drawn in by his storytelling and the novelty of his life. It was in part through this friendly nature that he supported himself, doing so by weaving rugs and fabrics, crafting trinkets, and writing books, which he sold to visitors. He even sold small books about himself, recounting his life and poems. According to his own accounts, people from all over the world actually came here to visit him at his humble cliffside home, and he became a kind of local attraction, a thoughtful, well-dressed, and articulate local attraction who had created an unusual but sustainable life of solitude. By 1890, he was even mentioned in local newspapers. For instance, the Gazetteer newspaper described him as an intelligent and industrious fellow. A contemporary Erving resident noted that Smith even genuinely seemed to enjoy his visitors. He was also known to avoid alcohol and tobacco and all forms of smoking. He also lived here perpetually alone, in large part, at least according to him, because of the heartbreak he experienced decades before that we talked about. This remained the reason he claimed that he never loved again. For over 30 years, he lived this way. But by October of 1899, having just turned 81, John was too frail to continue. He was moved into a small house in the nearby Montague, Massachusetts, where he lived out the rest of his days. He passed away in March of 1900. John Smith was buried in Erving Cemetery under a stone that reads, "The Hermit, John Smith." A cat's footprint is still visible on the marker, a footprint from one of the many cats that had kept him company in his cliffside home. His so-called castle still stands, and the site that is actually a cave, not a castle, can be visited today along the Hermit Cave Loop near Erving. His book, The Hermit of Erving Castle, Erving, Massachusetts, is archived by the Library of Congress and offers insight into his life, though only from his own perspective. It contains his writings and poetry, which shed some light on who he was, but given the use of the common pseudonym John Smith, it's not unreasonable to wonder whether he had something to hide during all this time. Still, his story stands as a quieter, perhaps happier version of that of Christopher Knight, the North Pond Hermit of Maine. Knight, too, lived alone in the woods for decades, surviving off the scraps of others in a life marked by secrecy and shame. I have to wonder if he had been born a century earlier, if he would have been able to live openly, like John Smith, the Hermit of Erving Castle. Back when I was in graduate school, I loved going for long bike rides to clear my head. I'd hop on my bike in Arlington and gradually pedal my way out to Worcester now and again, before tossing my bike aboard and riding the commuter rail back into the greater Boston area. And on these travels, there was a particular spot I'd stop in Westborough, their public library, where I'd usually lock up my bike and use the restroom and sometimes refill my water bottle. It was there that I came across this legend. See, one day, as I entered this library, I saw a sign that read, "Come and hear the story of Westborough's own Robin Hood, Tom Cook." Now, of course, Westborough was far from Arlington, so I never did make it to this history seminar, but I did write down and read up on this legend. A legend that tells the tale of a man, a thief, named Tom Cook. Tom, as the legend goes, was born a normal child in a blue plaster house on East Main Street in Westborough on October 6th of 1738. And it's said that shortly after he was born, he almost passed away of some sort of ailment, and his mother, being a loving individual, could hardly bear this fate, and it's said she made a deal with the devil to spare Tom's life. This deal would entail Tom's mother promising the devil that in his life Tom would serve him and cause mischief by being a thief. Terms the devil agreed to, and that was that. Or was it? You see, Tom grew up, and while he was obligated to serve the devil, the legend goes he had a kind heart, and instead of stealing for the sake of mischief, he stole and passed on his riches to those less fortunate than him. Stories of old tell of Tom stealing dinner from rich families and doling it out to the needy in the area. And there's even one fantastical tale of Tom going upstairs in a farmer woman's home and grabbing her straw bed after he heard a neighbor of his was ill with no bed. He wrapped this bed in a large sheet and carried it out to her front door, where he'd knock on the farmer woman's door and apparently ask her if he could leave this bed with her for a few days, which she declined, of course, and thus he left essentially knowing that she'd turned away her own bed. It was good stuff, really. Also, they even say his pockets were always full of children's toys, that, of course, he stole from local toy shops, and the local kids kept an eye out for Tom because of this. The devil, of course, isn't done with his part in the story, though. See, he perhaps rightfully felt like he was cheated, given Tom was actually doing good in the world. Thus, the legend says the devil would show up to Tom's door one morning to claim Tom's soul once and for all. And this happened when Tom turned 13. But the fun thing is, as much as the devil wasn't done with Tom, Tom also wasn't done with the devil. And in an act that would have made stingy Jack-o'-lantern proud, he asked the devil if he could just finish getting dressed before going with him to hell. The devil, of course, being a fool, saw no harm in this, and Jack sealed his fate. From then on, he was always missing a sock, or a shoe, or maybe even he left his shirt unbuttoned, and he'd outlast the devil, ultimately rising up to heaven, instead of ever following the devil to hell. According to some versions of the legend, he was actually ultimately confronted by a posse of wealthy farmers who Tom had previously robbed. They gave him the choice of the judge or the gauntlet of farmers, and he of course chose the latter, ultimately passing away at their hands, and then rising up to heaven. And that's the story. When I first read this, I thought this was a fun legend and nothing more. But the thing is, upon conducting research for this episode, things got pretty exciting. Jack, you see, wasn't just a legend. He was a very real person. He was born on October 6th of 1738 to Cornelius and Eunice Cook, and if you do a little bit of digging, you'll find records that suggest that Tom, rather than being massacred by a group of angry farmers, actually passed away, perhaps peacefully, on a poor farm in Westborough, which he was placed in after he crippled his legs in an accident in his old age. And the icing on the cake, it seems, is that Tom Cook, rather than English legend, may be the origin story for Robinhood. See, I'm not sure I can actually definitively tell you this, per my research, but scholars meeting at a conference on Robinhood at the University of Rochester, yes, that exists, basically came together and were in agreement that Robinhood is more of an American invention nowadays than one of Britain. Now, I will admit that Robinhood originally showed up in ballads and poems around the 15th century as a character, but these early ideas of Robin Hood were those of a rebel that wanted to destroy the establishment through less than savory tasks. See murder. Our modern version of Robin Hood that steals from the rich and gives back to the poor, however, was an Americanization of this earlier legend, a legend that started with this very real man named Tom Cook, right here in Westborough, Massachusetts. Okay, so here I'm going to tell you a story about a rock again. Yes, I told you a story about a rock wall already, and I also told you a story about a knight carved in rock, and I also recently told you about a man eating rock when I covered the Bennington Triangle. So hey, maybe I'm a geology channel rather than a folklore channel now. But by golly, I thought this rock was cool, and I found this picture of 4 kids sitting on this rock like the little rascals, and I thought it was awesome, so we're talking about more rocks. This rock in particular has a fascinating history, and it's located in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. Originally, and I'm talking about thousands of years ago, folks think it was cut and moved by a glacier from around southern New Hampshire, and then came to rest on a hill now known as Rollstone Hill, a place where hikers and picnickers frequent now, and a place which is now named in honor of this stone that used to rest upon it. The fun thing is, back in the 1800s, folks had quite the affinity for this massive 110-ton stone. Folks sat upon it, people had picnics in its shade, kids played on it. It was a real community affair. But the thing is, over time, erosion and perhaps human activity were giving this rock a real beating, and it began to crumble into pieces. The locals in Fitchburg loved it so much, though, that they'd begin to cover the boulder's cracks with cement starting in 1899, and even going so far as to surround it with an iron band to hold it together. But like that teddy bear you kept sewing the holes in as a kid, it was rapidly becoming worse for wear, and it was clear that local quarrying nearby would destroy the boulder, if nature wasn't going to beforehand. Thus, the community knew what it had to do. Somehow, in an act that I don't think could ever be decided upon in our modern world of bureaucratic bull junk, this community came together and decided that they were going to blow the boulder up to save it. Yes, you heard that right. It was decided upon at the Fitchburg Historical Society meeting, actually, way sooner than it was actually moved, on May 19th of 1902, but they would only move it when it was essentially in immediate danger. In 1929, the boulder was marked where they expected it to fracture, and, well, to start, they took off the metal banding around it, and it didn't crumble. And then they started smacking it with a sledgehammer. And then they even tried blowing it up with black gunpowder a couple of times, and finally, after like 3 times trying to blow it up, that would end up doing the trick. I guess they glued it together better than most folks first thought. Regardless, they then collected the pieces after it shattered, and a local stonemason named J. Mark LeBlanc reassembled them in the city's upper common, filling all of the gaps with concrete once again. In 1930, it even got a nice plaque reading, "This boulder carried by the last glacier from Mount Monadnock, New Hampshire, to the summit of this hill, whose name commemorates it, was for centuries a landmark to Indian and settler. Threatened with destruction, it was saved by popular subscription and reassembled here, 1920 to 1930. I should note, this plaque wasn't exactly correct, as the boulder wasn't necessarily from Mount Monadnock, New Hampshire. Rather, it was from some unknown location, probably just in central New Hampshire. Thus, today you can still see the Rollstone boulder. It's on a traffic island at Main Street and Rollstone Drive. Admittedly, I'd bet drivers have slammed into this thing over time, but by golly, I love it when a community decides they love a rock. And next time I'm in Massachusetts, I'm most certainly making my wife sit through my explanation of why this rock is in the middle of a roundabout as I go around it 100 times. When you think of breakfast, what do you usually think of? Nutrition? The most important meal of the day? Maybe a nice healthy helping of fruits and oats? Well, how would you feel if those oats were doused with a quantity of radiation similar to getting, let's say, 30 chest x-rays? How would you feel then? The scary part about this weird question is back in the 1940s, this was something that actually happened in Massachusetts. To start telling the story, let's go back to 1848 in Waltham, Massachusetts, where a school was founded named the Experimental School for Teaching and Training Idiotic Children, which, I know this is like 200 years ago, almost, but that is some slanderous dialect. Perhaps that's why it changed its name to the Massachusetts School for the Feeble-Minded, which is still brutal, in 1888. Regardless of its name, here, children that were disabled would essentially be taught, and it became quite the sprawling institution, with about 72 buildings and over 2,000 patients. This was the setting for this story. As for the characters, well, they of course included the patients here, but they also included Quaker Oats and scientists at MIT. The good folks over at Quaker Oats, you see, were pretty much rocking and rolling after in 1943, the U.S. Department of Agriculture introduced dietary guidelines recommending oatmeal as an ideal whole grain, and thus their sales went through the roof. That being said, competition was coming out, such as cream of wheat, that was making the claim that they were even more nutritious than Quaker's oatmeal. Quaker, you see, was threatened by these claims, and they wanted to prove definitively that cream of wheat was no better than them. As for the folks at MIT, well, they were essentially reached out to by Quaker Oats, and those folks said, "Hey guys, we'll give you a bit of money if you can run an experiment and tell us definitively if oats are more nutritious than cream of wheat." And don't get me wrong, they weren't paying for the results, they were paying for the experiment. This was ethical, at least in that single respect. So of course, MIT's scientists accepted. Thus, the object of this experiment was clear. The scientists at MIT wanted to definitively test how much iron and calcium made it into the bloodstream of kids that ate Quaker Oats versus those that ate cream of wheat. But the thing is, you can't just pull someone's blood and be like, "Oh yeah, that's cream of wheat calcium for sure." You need something to distinguish it from normal calcium. That's where something called a tracer comes in. A tracer is essentially a chemical compound where one or more of its atoms are replaced by a radioisotope, often produced by nuclear reactions. MIT scientists, you see, would lace radioactive iron and calcium tracers into some milk, and then they'd use this irradiated milk to make Quaker oatmeal and cream of wheat made by Farina. And once properly irradiated, they'd bust this good stuff over to the nice kids at the School for Disabled Kids in Waltham, and they'd serve them up a helping of Mama's favorite radiation-infused goodness. Ultimately, at the expense of these kids, it would be determined that cream of wheat was no better at delivering nutrients into children's bloodstreams than oatmeal. Quick aside, I'm not one to say any ism is far and away better than any other. Communism, socialism, capitalism, they all can suck in their own unique ways, but this is absolutely an incident where I roll my eyes and say, yay capitalism. This experiment would continue between 1943 and 1973, and MIT ultimately argued that this dosage was so low that kids exposed only had a slightly higher chance of getting cancer than those that didn't participate in the study. And from what I can tell, as recently as 1994, this finding was supported. Documents related to this experiment were declassified in 1993, drawing immediate and relatively harsh criticism. In modern day, MIT's leadership has at least expressed sorrow over their decision to carry these experiments out, though. Massachusetts, I sure miss ya, and I'm sorry last time I made y'all a video, I mispronounced the heck out of a few towns. Hopefully I did better this time. Regardless, if you had a good time with this one, let me know in the comments, and please subscribe and like the video if you want this channel to keep chugging along. Also, if you want MA to be featured soon in a Haunted Places video, tell me down below and it will go a long way towards getting that 2-hour plus video in your feed. With this in mind, whether you just crashed your car into that big ol' rock in Fitchburg, or if you had a power outage only to realize that your oatmeal was glow in the dark, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.